Hello there, and welcome to JJ Painting. I am JJ, and what do we do on this channel? Well, we do quite a few things, but we always talk about the hobby, you see, whether it's about the lore, how to help you with your hobby, tips and tricks on where to start. Sometimes it's a codex review, sometimes it's a novel review. There's a bit of something for everyone here. And today we're talking about stratagems, 40k's stratagems. And as anyone who's been in the hobby for a little while now knows, they've become quite a big thing in the last couple of years. And we're going to take a deep dive into how much they've changed the game of 40k, but also maybe why they haven't perhaps been the best influence on 40k as a whole. And for today, we're going to be painting this model right here. Yes, that's the model we're going to paint today. So, without further ado, let's crack on. Okay, so apart from the 10, maybe 15 of you who are listening who remember the Cities of Death expansion from about 2006, stratagems are actually a very new phenomenon in 40k as a whole. And it's probably worth remembering that when they first came around in 8th edition, quite a few of the abilities that they presented to the units were special rules that had existed in previous codexes. There were also special rules that had existed within things such as Planet Strike and Apocalypse, and it was clear that Games Workshop wanted to incorporate them back into the armies that had them originally, but weren't quite sure how to do it. Well, with the March of Progress, we finally found ourselves with stratagems and the command points as well. And it's interesting to think that there are now effectively two forms of in-game currency for 40k. There's command points and then just regular points or requisition points, whatever we call them these days. And I draw attention to this first of all because it's worth remembering that stratagems were clearly well received in 8th edition. Otherwise, Games Workshop wouldn't have made it a fundamental point of 9th edition to make having command points so much easier and also getting them at a starting amount that was much, much higher, even at relatively small games. And this is important because when stratagems first arrived, they did something which hadn't really been seen a lot in 40k in the past, and that was allowing players to perform actions outside of a unit's datasheet or immediate army rules. If any of you have watched my video about why 8th and 9th edition are better than all the previous editions of 40k, you'll remember me saying that the universal special rules were a bit of a problem, because the universal special rules applied to all armies equally with absolutely no variance or alteration, which in some respects was okay. It did mean that everyone was singing from the same hymn sheet, but it did mean that on a certain fundamental level, every single army was playing the same no matter what, so the only thing that was different was the aesthetics. But here we are in 8th and 9th edition with stratagems, have changed the landscape of 40k quite fundamentally, and to a degree I think more so than anyone could have really predicted at the time. I've actually seen quite a few people nowadays when it comes to looking at 9th edition codexes and even some of the 8th edition codexes, that the conversation tends to revolve around stratagems almost more so than it revolves around things such as army traits or individual data sheets. Now, there is a good reason for this. Stratagems tend to be able to be applied to multiple units, whereas obviously the army-wide traits are going to apply to everything, and obviously individual data sheets are only going to apply to that unit. So stratagems do have a lot of utility, and I would argue that one of the good things about them is they do bridge the gap that was sorely needed in 40k, a way to use your units in a slightly more creative and slightly more unconventional way. Some of the really obvious ones, which allow you to do things like just add 1 to your hit and or wound rolls, they're quite straightforward, and they don't really have much to say about, and there's not a lot going into them. But a lot of armies have quite interesting stratagems, such as allowing you to max out your random damage on your number of attacks or your damage roll. Some of them allow you to do things such as remaining stationary after you've moved for the purposes of firing heavy weapons. Some of them even allow you to shoot at units that are coming in as reinforcements or from teleport strike. Those are the interesting ones, and those are the ones that I think are worth mentioning, simply because they're the ones that provide a completely new way of looking at how units can operate and allows you to do things with your units that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do in any previous edition. So I'm saying all these nice things about stratagems to start off with, just to give a firm sense of context as to why they became so popular so quickly. And even if I very specifically look at armies such as Chaos Space Marines and Eldar for a second, and I pick these two for a very clear reason, both of their stratagems were largely brought over from things that they had in previous editions of their codexes, previous expansions, and other things here, there, and everywhere that worked into their army. And it was nice to have them, to be fair, brought into their codex in a way that could be used more readily. But when it comes to it, at the basic level for both these armies as well, because so many of their stratagems were based off of older ideas, in some respects you could argue that they didn't get a lot of new ideas into their codex when it came to stratagems to begin with. But then we look at armies such as Adeptus Sororitas, or the Sisters Battle, and the Mechanicus, and the Drakari, and the Death Guard, which are all newer codexes, grant you, but it also shows the difference between 8th edition stratagems and 9th edition stratagems. 9th edition stratagems are very much building on the idea that 8th edition started, which is new ways to use the army by introducing slowly new ideas to all the armies. So for example, in the Sisters Battle, they again have stratagems that allow you to max out the number of shots you have on things such as flamers. For Death Guard, they have stratagems that allow you to stack damage across the units, so it isn't lost if the model you're attacking is destroyed, and it goes on such as that. Is that early on when stratagems first arrived, you'd maybe get 2, potentially 3 pages of stratagems. But in the Space Marine Codex, you're having at the moment 4 full pages of stratagems, and the Death Guard Codex is very much the same. And the fact of the matter is that when you have that many stratagems, it then begs the question, first of all, why do we need so many stratagems? And what are they contributing? Now, in the case of the Space Marine Codex and the Death Guard Codex especially, there are lots of stratagems that are specific to certain units. But that also then begs the question of why are they stratagems and why aren't they just special abilities for that unit? And again, you could raise the question that these are abilities that have a certain power balance issue. If they were accessible and available all the time, the unit would be fundamentally broken. However, the ability itself would not be that effective if it was only a once per game ability, because it's not guaranteed to make that much of an impact. Some abilities will once per game be enough. Others won't, unfortunately, and I think this was partly the compromise, but also partly the way to keep them accessible. And in that respect, it does make sense. It allows the players to go back and use the abilities whenever they need to, and it puts the control in the players' hands rather than in the hands of the game writers. But again, this may not sound particularly negative, and it shouldn't, because these were positive things. And like I said at the very beginning of this video, fundamentally, I think stratagems are a good idea. But now we're starting to get into the territory of why there's a bit of an issue with them. If we look at a lot of the reviews that have come out for the 9th edition codexes so far, you'll notice a surprisingly large amount of time is dedicated to talking about stratagems. And as I said earlier on, this seems to take up a bigger chunk of the conversation than data sheets, than battle traits, and anything else really, or warlord traits, or anything else. And I feel that the reason for this is because stratagems have become such a big part of 40k that a lot of players have almost become a bit too reliant on them. And I just want to ask a question. When was the last time any of you 40k players out there have played a game and not maxed out your command points? Just an honest question. And I'm not talking necessarily about regenerating command points or refunding command points. I'm talking you've genuinely not run out of command points, or you've not been reduced down to 2. And if you're playing a game which is about 1,000 to 2,000 points, you're starting off with between 9 to 12 command points anyway. And obviously, they keep generating every turn. But I'm genuinely curious as to how many of you haven't needed that extra command point to be generated every turn. How many of you have just been able to let them stack up and just play the game without stratagems? And this isn't me saying you shouldn't use them. This is just me genuinely asking, have you been able to play games without using them? But I think this gets me to my next point as to why stratagems have become so big. Is because when you come to spending points on building your army list, you can't do much about that in the game itself. However, command points you generate throughout the game now in 9th edition, you didn't in 8th, but you do now in 9th. And obviously, stratagems allow you to do quite a lot of things. So in some respects, you're still spending on your army, so to speak, during the game to do certain actions and perform certain tasks and and to either buff or debuff certain units. And these aren't necessarily bad things at all, as I say, but because there are so many command points now available to everyone, and there are so many stratagems across all the codexes, that it really begs the question of why not just do this all the time? Why would you need to do anything else? And this is what gets me onto the point of why stratagems have become such a big focus of so many reviews and so much of the conversation around 40k. And a lot of it boils down to the fact that because there are so many stratagems, people are trying to figure out what stratagems are applicable to what units. Now, if you're playing Space Marines, or you're playing Death Guard, you'll probably understand this, and even Necrons actually, you'll probably understand this quite easily, what I'm about to say. Not every stratagem is born equally. There are stratagems in every codex that only apply to maybe 1 or 2 units in that army. And if you don't have those units in your army, then you're out of luck, unfortunately. And that would be less of a problem if it wasn't for the fact that there are quite a few of these stratagems in every codex. Some people have made the point of saying that in every codex you are only ever going to, in theory, be able to access half the stratagems in your codex anyway, whether that's to do with army-specific traits, sub-factions, specific units, characters, etc. There's a big chunk of those stratagems which you immediately can't use necessarily, unless you build your army around that. And we'll get back to that in a second. But the other thing to bear in mind is that when you've got those, there are often stratagems which don't look particularly overpowered on paper, and to be fair to them, they're really not. However, because these are the stratagems which have the most obvious and most beneficial things, such as adding 1 to your hit and or wound rolls, being able to subtract things from your opponent's hit rolls, being able to max out your damage for random attacks, that sort of thing, those are the sorts of stratagems that people will immediately gravitate to and you'll see really frequently. other ones which are a bit more specialised and vary from army to army. And I suppose the most obvious example are ones which are army specific, so it's things such as Eldar being able to cast additional psychic powers, or Death Guard being able to use their Poxwalkers to inflict mortal wounds. Things such as that you'll see less frequently, only because they're less generic, as it were. So in some respects, the generic USRs have come back into 40k in the form of stratagems, but they look different to how they did about 5 years ago when they were all called the same thing. And then this brings me on to my next point. Because there's so much obsession around stratagems, it does, I believe, affect people's purchase choices. So some people will look at an entire army, for example, of Sisters of Battle or Necrons or Dark Eldar or Death Guard, take your pick, and then they will look at what the units do, but then they will definitely be looking at the stratagems. And because the stratagems have so many buffs and debuff effects on the army itself, it's become a core rather than auxiliary part of the army. And when I say that, I mean that it means that you can very much build your army list around the stratagems you can use in your army, rather than around the models you want, or even the battle tactics you want to use. And that's not a problem, but it's definitely going to be an issue down the line, where people are starting to base more and more of their armies around stratagems, and you will almost see a separate section in almost every single review of saying how good is an army stratagems, and I don't really think that should be the point. The point should very much be down to, as always, what you want out of your army, but also down to what models you're going to have in an army. Because the other thing to remember about stratagems and command points is they are a finite resource in game. And I've seen people get annoyed at running out of command points early. I've seen people stressing whilst playing the game about the fact that they're running down the overall number of command points they have left. And I kind of feel that defeats a lot of the purpose of the game, which is not to be stressing about how many command points you have left, but rather to actually enjoy the fact you have the models that you put time and energy into building and painting to play with, and they should look good on the table. For me, that's really what the point of this is, not stressing over stratagems. I just want to quickly summarise what we've covered so far in this video. So far, we've talked a lot about previous editions as well, and how the stratagems very much feel like older rules, both army-specific and universal, that have been condensed into a new form that allows people to use them in a balanced way. And that is very much true, and that's very much the case as to what the origins of stratagems have been. But now, that was 8th edition. And then with the 8th edition stratagems, by bringing rules that didn't really fit into previous codexes but were army specific from other expansions, it's allowed Games Workshop to see how these rules actually work when they are more readily available in regular games of 40k. But then when we move on to 9th edition, just to summarise the point quickly, we've now started seeing new ideas going into the stratagems. Okay, so that's where we are so far. But the point I want to make, which kind of comes off the back of all of this and starts to surmise this, is that because stratagems have become such a big part of 40k, and command points have become such a big part of 40k, and Games Workshop knows this now, is why you get more of them in 9th edition than you did in 8th edition, is that when it comes down to looking at individual armies, it's almost hard to separate the stratagems from the data sheets. It's hard to separate a tactical marine from the stratagems he has access to. It's hard to separate a plague marine from the stratagems he has access to. And you have to remember that this isn't like warlord traits. This isn't like auras. This isn't like relics. Relics and warlord traits and aura abilities are buffs and debuffs, and they have lots of benefits. But the difference between them is that because those are part of the data sheet, they are always there. They are part of the composition of the army. And as a result, as a player, it's worth you remembering that they're there. You have to remember that they're there. But with stratagems, they are an added extra. And I have seen a lot of people, and I've done this myself, and I'm sure you've done it as well, flicking through their codexes the first few times they play a game, trying to figure out what stratagems they can and cannot use. And I do think to a degree that does slow down the game a little bit. And I think this is sort of where Age of Sigmar, interestingly enough, with their command abilities, have maybe slightly gotten it a bit more right by, in their new core book, actually showing you what command abilities you can use and where you can use them, rather than plonking all the stratagems onto one page, or all the command abilities onto one page, and then desperately having to figure out if you can use them, if you've got the models that can access them, and if you've got enough command points for them. So this is something to bear in mind going forward. And is this me saying that Age of Sigmar has a better way of handling command points and command abilities? No, it's not. But what I am saying with 40k is because the stratagems have exploded in such an enormous way, they've become such a big part of 40k so quickly, I think everyone is still reeling a little bit, and it is changing the game in quite a fundamental way, and it's not necessarily a negative way, but in a way we're going to have to take into very careful consideration going forward. And the last point I want to make on this is that I remember for a very long time things like stratagems were the sorts of things people did actually want in 40k. People wanted a little bit more flavour to the game, they wanted to be able to do a little bit more with their units, and they wanted to find something else to add to their army.
And whilst I think stratagems were definitely an option, I don't think they should have been considered as the only option. There are still other things that can come to 40k to completely change the landscape of the game, and I don't believe that stratagems are the only thing to do that. I think there could be more things in the future. Do I think that stratagems should be scaled back on? Yes. When we think about how many stratagems there are and how many of them are army-specific, or unit-specific rather, I do think in that respect it makes more sense almost for unit-specific stratagems to almost become abilities on a data sheet rather than a stratagem that's in the stratagem page but 90% of your army can't use. So, to conclude on what I've said so far, stratagems have changed 40k, both for better and for worse. For better, they allow your units to do more, but for worse, they've slowed down the game and they are having a slightly too strong impact, I think, on armies overall. And in the future, I think it's probably worth remembering that if we are going to see stratagems continuing to be a big part of 40k, perhaps they need to be integrated slightly better, but also at the same time, they do bring a lot to the game right now, and they are very popular right now, that there is still lots of goodwill, and there's lots of good things still to come from them. But in any case, I want to hear your thoughts on it. What do you think about stratagems? Do you think there's too many of them? Do you think armies need more? Do you agree that an entire army can live or die on its stratagems? Let me know your thoughts. I look forward to hearing from you.
Those are my thoughts on how 40k has changed due to stratagems. In some cases for the better, in some cases in areas that may still need to be improved upon. But anyway, let me know what you guys think down below, and whilst you're down there commenting, like, subscribe, all that good YouTube shitty stuff. Check out my website to see the sort of stuff I provide, look at my Patreon if you want to get involved, and maybe just have a look at my Instagram if you want to see some nice pictures of toy soldiers. But in any case, thank you very, very much for watching. New videos, by the way, on Wednesdays and Fridays. Until then, next time, goodbye, and have a lovely day.